Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about album number 3 from M83, Before the Dawn Heals Us. So, this album marks a bit of a change in the M83 story. The first two albums saw this band working as the duo of Anthony Gonzalez and Nicholas Fromigo, but a year after their last album, Dead Cities, Red Seas, and Lost Ghosts came out, Fromigo broke off the band entirely and left M83 to be helmed by Gonzalez alone. And of course, with such a change in personnel comes a change in sound. Though, perhaps not the kind of change you'd expect. Strangely enough, the first M83 album after said departure sounds more like a full band effort than any other album in their catalog. A switch over to a more straightforward pop-rock influenced sound and the least electronic entrant in their catalog to date. Obviously, it's not an entirely one-man effort. Loic Moram got brought in for drumming and still plays in the band for live shows to this day. Matthew Denis plays bass on a few tracks. Sorry for butcher pronunciations on these. And there's a couple of guest vocalists and even a full children's choir on a few tracks as well. Oh, and Gonzalez got some help from his brother with writing lyrics, too. But Gonzalez still plays most of the instruments himself and handles all the songwriting and arrangement and that kind of stuff. There's still plenty of synths to be found all over the place, but they're no longer the primary driving force behind the album and are mostly just window dressing behind compositions, which are primarily built out of live drums and guitars. It has electronic elements, but it's clearly a rock album first and foremost, playing to a rock audience. On Discogs, it's even marked as falling under emo, in addition to the usual subgenres like ambient and noise and shoegaze. Which isn't inaccurate. If this album had come out like 2-3 years ago and weren't part of the discography of a band that does tend to stray closer to my usual element than this, I probably wouldn't have reviewed it at all. But here I am anyway, not just because I can't very well skip over it during a discography review, but also because I've recently started to feel like I should be less picky about what does or doesn't qualify as electronic. The line is blurry, and my format covers what I want to cover or what I feel like my perspective would be useful on. Anyway, Before the Dawn Heals Us is a noticeable step up from the first two M83 albums, and in a lot of ways is the point at which this band really came into its own and became recognizable as the M83 you know today. There's still a lot of the same epic, noise-heavy soundscape material that showed up through their first two albums, but there's also more of a tuneful approach to everything with more lead vocals from Gonzalez himself. Not to mention, the production is just so much better this time around. The first two albums stuck to a pretty lo-fi kind of sound and tried to convey their epicness with a lot of distortion, which I wasn't as crazy about. And while this album also has its fair share of distorted guitars, the mixes give everything a lot more space to breathe and feel a lot more open and sprawling. That all on its own rose it above the first two albums for me. Honestly, I always got some similar vibes out of this album that I do to something like Coldplay's X and Y. That is meant to be a compliment, by the way, that's a good album. While obviously Coldplay were aiming for much broader strokes that can make M83's brand of intimacy look edgy by comparison, I feel like the core appeal is somewhere in the same ballpark, with all its soaring rock compositions, uplifting nostalgic melodies, and even some of the ways it implements synths into the mix. If this was the album that blew up in the same way that Hurry Up We're Dreaming did, I bet it would have gone over pretty well playing to the big crowds those guys played to. Now, I'm not sure if this album quite reaches greatness for me. I'll admit I did kinda miss the more abstract and electronic-focused ethos of their previous work, and I think their debut is stronger from a purely compositional standpoint. At least it's more up my alley. This album can be a bit spotty at times, with some cuts hitting a lot more for me than others. But also a lot of that is a personal taste thing, and, I mean, the step up in production does feel like a fair trade-off to some of the changes in style. This is an all-around very good album that approaches greatness in many moments. And once again, this would make perfect sense to me if you marked it as your favorite M83 album overall. It is definitely a very dynamic album, contrasting a lot of hard-hitting noisy highs with lower-key ambient moments of respite, and gets every piece to feel like it hits with some solid emotional resonance, even the moments I don't care for as much. The album does start out really strong with opener Moonchild, starting out with emotional piano progressions and voiceover from Kate Moran, telling some abstract kid's story about creating the moon, exploding into a blaring mix of intense buzzing synth bass, slow building blocks of chords and wiry theremin-like leads, aided by the choir. It sounds absolutely huge and expansive and really well sets the tone and captures that sense of childlike wonder that permeates through pretty much everything that M83 ever released from this point onwards. Though that track is contrasted with Don't Save Us From the Flames, which, honestly, I'm not quite as crazy about. It is way noisier and louder, an intense and much faster paced wall of distorted guitars, alien synth leads and crashing drums, and a pretty solid memorable tune behind it. Stylistically not as much my bag, but also featuring a lot of Gonzalez's own falsetto vocals, which are a bit on the grating side. I suspect I'm in the minority of people who don't consider this cut to be one of the better moments here, what with it being the most popular and successful single off the album. And the lyrics about dying in a car crash, or definitely something, just doesn't hit me quite as much as it seems to for most people. It feels a bit like claustrophobic in comparison with some of the other louder moments here, and many of said cuts offer even stronger tunes in my eyes. Fields, Shorelines, and Hunters is another example of a louder moment that I'm not as crazy about here, being probably the blockiest and noisiest cut in the bunch, with its banging drums, blaring guitars, and crashing experimental noise, swallowing up its more carefree synth leads. The track does go hard, but I don't think I can really call it a big favorite. With that said, there are some similarly abrasive moments in the first half that hit me a lot more effectively than those two. Asterisk may be another really intense cut, but I think that one's great. Starting out with some slow-building synth riffs and proceeding with some really wildly dynamic change-ups between the abrasive walls of guitars and synth noise and crashing drums, abruptly cutting back and forth every few bars into some minimal, isolated synth bass. A lot of really fun tension and release created with that one, and I think the rollicking epicness of that composition translated with me a lot more effectively. I've also grown to really like the other big popular single, Teen Angst. I think out of all the more abrasive moments on the album, this one has easily the strongest of the tunes and melodies driving it, and the way the synths and choirs are worked into the mix make it sound that much more expansive and emotional. Also quite like the lyrics, which, as per the title, tried to capture the feelings of a real-life emotional teenager, and does it in such a simple but effective way through its metaphors of burning out quickly, bringing images of, like, shooting stars to mind. It's obviously not like M83 were the first to the idea, or that there wasn't an entire scene in rock around that time which delves primarily into that kind of subject matter. Like I said, this album getting labeled as emo on Discogs isn't inaccurate, but they do really capture it well in a way that pulled me in more and more every time I put it on. Now, as many louder moments as there are here, as I mentioned, this album does its best to balance out the abrasive cuts with much lower key and ambient-centric cuts, most of which are much more synth-driven and perhaps unsurprisingly tend to be bigger favorites of mine. Not to say there aren't some exceptions. I Guess I'm Floating is a fine enough synth interlude that doesn't leave a strong impression. Farewell Goodbye is a heartfelt and bright ambient synth pop tune that, while I do like and think sounds quite nice, especially with the interplay between the two guest vocalists, Ben Plang and Lisa Papineau, it was never a huge favorite when it came on, in a way that I'd have a hard time pinning down. I guess it doesn't resonate as strongly from like a melodic or chord progression standpoint, feels a bit more musically basic than some other moments here, I don't know. The track's still pretty decent anyway, I never skip it. But actually my least favorite moment on the album overall is also more of an ambient-centric interlude. Can't Stop is the worst cut here by a country mile. The ambient synth backdrop on that one is fine enough, but this track features more of Gonzalez's falsetto singing, and while he is technically hitting the notes, if I want to be charitable, oh my god, he is straining so hard and going so far out of his range trying to hit notes that high. He unintentionally sounds in pain, like someone's just kicked him in the nuts, and it's not trying to be a pained kind of track. It just makes my throat hurt just listening to him, like, Jesus Christ. With that said, there are obviously a lot of lower key moments that I think really work. In the Cold I'm Standing is a fantastic ambient composition with lots of really dramatic pads of strings and choirs ready-made to soundtrack someone's death scene in a movie. And of course, there's also the entire final stretch of the album. I feel like every track on this thing from Safe onwards is a major highlight for me in some way. Safe itself is a beautifully dramatic piano ballad that starts out sounding like some sappy 70s singer-songwriter kind of cut. Gonzalez offering some falsetto vocals that actually sound pretty good and not like a strain. Kind of gives me some similar feelings to like some Alan Parsons Project ballads or something, I don't know. But as it goes on, the pianos are joined by these much more intense synth pads which really make that track go the extra mile. And that track pays off into another absolutely gorgeous interlude in Let Men Burn Stars, with all its airy and breathy vocal harmonies, emotional freeform pianos, and spacey pads. Car Chase Terror has a really interesting idea behind it. It's built around another performance from Kate Moran, which is meant to sound like sample dialogue from a horror movie, except it's original to this album. Moran is playing both a mother and a daughter character who are running away from some mysterious figure, though she uses the exact same tone of voice for both characters as if it's the same person with dissociative identity disorder or something. I will admit this track did get diminishing returns with repeat listens, and the noisier rock instrumental that builds up underneath it isn't really anything to write home about. This track likely wouldn't stick with me nearly as much without that dialogue, but it still definitely services the album well, and the way it pays off into another ambient interlude, Slight Night Shiver, which is nothing but calming synth pads and field recordings of passing cars, that works really well, and that interlude wouldn't resonate with me as strongly without all the build-up that the previous cut provided. And then there's the final two cuts. You got One Last Louder Rock cut in A Guitar and a Heart, which has some more minor key chord progressions I quite like, and its guitar leads going over more expansive choir pads in a really freaking cool way. Definitely another one of the best louder cuts on here. But that finally leads to the closer, Lower Your Eyelids to Die with the Sun. Now, when I first heard this album many years ago, I looked at the track listing and I saw this album ended in a big 10-minute cut, and I braced myself, because I remembered how the last two albums' closers only got to the lengths they did thanks to long silences and hidden tracks. I was expecting this to be the same. But no, this track actually is 10 minutes. That length is not bullshitting you with any, dated CD gimmicks. It is exactly what it advertises itself to be. And goddamn, what a way to close out the album. A massive, long-winded post-rock epic with giant synth pads, more choirs, and even a full orchestra joining in. There's not much progression over the course of its length, just the same huge-sounding, slow-moving chord progression, building up to epic heights and very slowly dying down to subtle ambience at the very end. But even so, talk about a climactic finish. Ending an album full of dramatic and emotionally intense moments with the most intense moment of all, at once feeling both harrowing and ghostly but also celebratory and relieving, might very well be the single strongest album closer M83 have ever had. But yeah, that's everything on Before the Dawn Heals Us. Definitely not a perfect album by any stretch, definitely has its ups and downs for me, but even the low points still fit well enough into the overall mix and never feel out of place. Maybe with the slight exception of Can't Stop, but that one clunker obviously is not enough to take away from all the good this album delivers. I do still think that M83 would go on to even further improve upon some of the formulas they set with this project, and I also find it kind of funny that despite this album being the first without Fromago and being so much more of a rock project than having the electronic ethos of their first two albums, Gonzalez and Fromago's artistic trajectories actually both went in the reverse direction that this album implied they would. M83 would go on to double down on the more electronic aspects of their sound in the following years, while Fromago would go on to join an indie rock band called Team Ghost, who mostly make music that sounds like this album. So yeah, that's kind of funny, but Before the Dawn Heals Us is a really freaking good album. I do have my hang-ups with it that prevent it from quite reaching 8 out of 10 territory for me, and there are still albums further on in their catalog that connect with me even more, but I cannot deny the moments that do hit on here really do hit, and there are unquestionably more hits than misses here. And once again, if you did get a life-changing experience out of it, I can definitely see why this gets a very strong 7.7 out of 10 from me. But of course, it's just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.